Thank you. Oh, not that one. Yeah. Howdy, how everybody. Thank you guys so much for coming. We're going to give about 2 more minutes to about 12:05 for everybody come on in and have a great time. Thank you all for showing up. We got a couple people on Teams. I think we cannot share the live stream camera and the presentation at the same time. So you guys will probably just see the presentation, but you guys will hear audio, which is a good thing.
Here to support Jalen no matter what. That's nice. I guess you think about it.
All righty, y'all. It's 12:05. We're going to get started. This is from the DEIB Council. We're here to celebrate Native American history. So we just want to thank everybody for showing up in regards to that. We got Dr. Smallwood here from NCCU. He's decided to give us about an hour of his time for questions and answers afterwards. But he's going to go ahead and give us about 15, 20-minute presentation. And I really think it's going to be delightful. Learned a lot when talking with him and vetting the process and learning about the Tuscarora tribe and things that goes with that. But I'm not going to steal his thunder. Dr. Smallwood, come on up. I'll start your presentation.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for coming out. And I will the presentation I'm going to give is basically about the Tuscaroras of North Carolina. And I'm not sure how many people really know who the Tuscaroras are, have heard of the Tuscaroras. Oftentimes when you talk about Native people in North Carolina, people will think of Cherokees and they'll think of Lumbees, but they don't think of the Tuscaroras. And in fact, the Tuscaroras were the group of Indians that were the most dominant in the state of North Carolina. And it wasn't until after the Tuscarora War that the colony of North Carolina was able to expand and really create what became the state of North Carolina. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about those people today and, some of their history today. So next slide. So as I said before, when you think about Native Americans in North Carolina, and we talk about the Tuscaroras in particular, although most people don't think of the Tuscaroras and don't realize that how significant they are to the history of the state of North Carolina, they were the dominant group in North Carolina. So you have Tuscaroras, and then the west of them, west and south of the Cape Fear River, you have the Catawbas, and then a number of other southeastern Indians. But the Cherokees, who we often associate with being in North Carolina, really weren't even in the state of North Carolina. They were really primarily in Tennessee, although there were some people who end up on the North Carolina side. And if we talk about the Eastern Band, which I may touch on briefly, but by and large, the native group that was native to North Carolina were the Tuscaroras, and they dominated Eastern North Carolina, the coastal plains, and coming down out of Virginia in the mountains, pretty much everything north of the Cape Fear River, pretty much was under their influence. So until we think about the Tuscaroras and think about native people generally in the Eastern Woodlands, which is what they were called, Eastern Woodlands peoples, it's important to think of the Tuscaroras as a language group, right? So the Tuscaroras were basically what we call Haudenosaunee. The French gave them the name Iroquois, and we consider them Iroquois, but their traditional name is Haudenosaunee. And they basically are part of the Haudenosaunee family, which included other Iroquoian speaking or peoples from the Great Lakes region, and then also in North Carolina. Now, the Cherokees, which also were in North Carolina, were technically Iroquois and did come from the Iroquois people, but they had merged with the Muskegon people who were, Creeks in North Alabama, North Georgia, and for all intent and purposes, the Cherokees considered themselves to be Creek or be Muskegon. So when we think of language groups, I point out to people, you want to basically think about, if you think of Europe, you think of French, German, English. If you think of English and you think of the fact that you have the Australians speak English, the people in the US speak English, the people in England speak English, just different variations of English, but it's the same language. That's what we're talking about with the Iroquoian people. So Iroquois is a language, and of those Iroquoian people, you have Mohawk. Most people have heard of Mohawks and Mohawks, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, Tuscaroras, and then a host of other Iroquois-speaking Indians, the Susquehannas, the Hurons, and others in the Great Lakes region, but they were all connected. So what is that ancient history, right? So I'm going to touch on these being North Carolina-based Indians. But before they were North Carolina-based Indians, they have an ancient history First of all, in North Carolina, if we talk about in eastern North Carolina, the burial mounds that have been excavated in Indian Woods and in Bertie County, those burial mounds date to between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. So we're talking an ancient people in North Carolina, have an old ancient history here in North Carolina. But prior to that, thousands of years prior to that, they migrate from the Northeast, which is where the Six Nations originate. And then from there, they come from the Mississippi River Valley and from the ancient native city of Cahokia, which was a massive city, one of the biggest cities in the world. And from Cahokia, they go back down into Central and South America and really, basically are a culture that is similar to the Aztecs or the Mayans. If you were to travel to St. Louis today, basically, and whether it's East St. Louis on the, eastern side of the Mississippi, the ancient city of Cahokia is still there. You could actually walk up the great ancient mounds. These are earthen mounds that are just as massive as the pyramids in Mesoamerica with the Mayans and the Incas, and they are still there. And of course, there was a great natural disaster. In recent times, we've seen hurricanes like in New Orleans, and we understand that there can be a great natural disaster that can cause the displacement of people. And so there's a great natural disaster, a flood in the Mississippi River Valley area that forced those Indians to migrate east to what became New York State. And there in New York State, they divided into what became, the Five Nations or Six Nations, including the Tuscaroras. And then the Tuscaroras left their kinsmen in the north and migrated to North Carolina. While in North Carolina or in the Carolina-Virginia region, they basically subdivide. So we have the Nottaways, who are still in Virginia today. The chief of the Nottaway Nation, Chief Lynette Austin, still there today. The Meharans, and the Meharans are still in, basically Hertford County today, in Ahoskie. A lot of people have heard of Ahoskie over in Northeast North Carolina. And then the Tuscaroras, scattered throughout the rest of eastern North Carolina. But the Meharans and the Nottaways are basically Tuscaroras. Next slide. So how do they come to be in North Carolina? Well, they come down the Appalachian Valley, the Tuscaroras do. And they come out, they exit, the Appalachian Valley at what is today Roanoke, Virginia. Roanoke, Virginia is the source of the Roanoke River. It comes down and flows from Roanoke, Virginia, right on down into eastern North Carolina, into the Chowan River, then the Albemarle Sound, and then, of course, access out to the Outer Banks into the ocean. As the Tuscaroras come down the Roanoke River Valley, they separate along the Meharan River, which still exists, of course, in Virginia, the Nottaway River in Virginia, and they basically populate and settle along those rivers as they come down into eastern North Carolina. So they're settling in the river basins. Why? Because you get easy access to the water to travel. Same reasons why we settle on the water today in North Carolina. If we talk about Wilmington, or if we talk about the cities in the Chesapeake and Virginia on the James, because it's easy navigation, easy trade. Native Americans canoed and traded all over eastern U.S. So natural, and they set on the high ground and they want to farm. So they are able to use the river for fishing, also for transportation and transporting goods. So these river valleys become very important. Next slide. So not only are they in the Northeast on the Roanoke River and the Tar, and but they also come south in North Carolina and they settle along the Tar River and the Neuse River. So the Tar River, if you know your geography of North Carolina, we're talking about basically Tarboro, and we're getting into Rocky Mount. And then the Neuse River, we're getting down into places like Griffin, and we're getting down into places like Snow Hill and also New Bern. Okay. So every major river in eastern North Carolina, and if you include the Nottaways and the Meharans, every major river from southeast Virginia down to the Cape Fear, basically that was the heartland and the territory for the Tuscarora Nation in eastern North Carolina. And they extend as far south as the Cape Fear River. So they go down. So everything pretty much north of the Cape Fear River and then west up to the mountains was either the hunting grounds or the primary settlements for the Tuscaroras, who end up being the dominant nation of Indians here in eastern North Carolina. Okay. And you can move one more. This just gets down into the Catawba area. So if we talk about the Cape Fear being the border for the Tuscaroras, then you have a little no man's land between the Cape Fear and the Catawba territories, and the Catawbas are along the Catawba River and the PD River. So Catawba's the south, but everything north is Tuscaroras. Okay. So if we want to simplify it in terms of Indian nations and approximately where these Indian peoples were in southeastern Virginia and in eastern North Carolina. Oh, go back one slide. Then this is what we're talking about. Yes. So this is what we're talking about. So we have, of course, the Powhatan Confederacy, and most people know Virginia history in 1607 with the Virginians settling in Virginia. You know the Powhatans, and you know the conflicts with the Virginians and the Powhatans. So you have the Powhatan Confederation and the Powhatans, and then you have a host of different Indians that are a part of that, including the Chesapeake Indians, the Nazman Indians. There's a whole different, sections, different groups of Indians that are there in that particular region. But then you come down into northeastern North Carolina, and then you have your Choanoke Indians or Chowan Indians, you have your Tuscarora Indians, you have your Noosk and your Core Indians, your Machapungas, and the other Indian groups that are in western North Carolina. And so these are the nations of Indians that were in the state of North Carolina, Algonquin-speaking peoples in the extreme coastal areas of North Carolina. But the dominant group of Indians that those Indians basically were in alliance with would be the Tuscarora Indians, who controlled everything from pretty much Greensboro, Raleigh, Winston-Salem, all the way south to the coast. I'm not going to go over all of these nations of Indians, but there are lots of groups of Indians, right? There are lots of nations of Indians. In what became the United States, there are over 500 nations of Indians. East of the Mississippi, there are hundreds of nations of Indians. They tend to be smaller groups of Indians, clans of Indians, but they tend to be confederated. So there is a distinct name for the different groups of Indians, and there are your Iroquois-speaking Indians, as I just talked about, language groups, and your Algonquin-speaking Indians, but they're different groups, different factions, but they are united by language. The other thing to remember about Tuscaroras is that all of these groups of Indians in eastern North Carolina and southeast Virginia traded with the Tuscaroras, and they had to speak the Tuscarora language because they were the most powerful group of Indians in the region, right? What's the trading language of the world? It's French and English, right? Everybody knows English because we're the superpower, right? Everybody knows French because it's the language of diplomacy. People communicate in French. And you have to understand that was what was happening with the Tuscaroras here in eastern North Carolina. So these are just all of the nations of Indians, smaller bands and groups of Indians scattered throughout the region. I won't go over all of them, but just to show that, we have a pretty good knowledge of and understanding of those groups of Indians scattered throughout the region. But all of it, as I said before, basically constituting the Tuscaroras are the dominant group in North Carolina, and they dominate trade and alliances with different groups of Indians. And they are oftentimes in conflict with the Indians in the Southeast, particularly the Creeks, the Yamasees, the Santee, the Cherokees. They were all enemies of the Tuscarora. But the Tuscarora stood alone. And they stood alone because they were reinforced by their military alliance with the Five Nations, which I'm going to touch on in just a minute. So one of the things I think people forget about, and we aren't taught about in North Carolina history, is the influence of the Spanish. Okay. Our history starts with the English. It starts with the Lost Colony. It starts in Virginia. And we forget that there were hundreds of years, at least 100 years of history between the Spanish and native peoples prior to the arrival of the English. So the Spanish. It's important to understand that Spanish came into the New World or into the Western Hemisphere in 1492. And from 1492 until 1584, they conquered all of Central America, the Caribbean, Mexico, and forcibly converted all of the native peoples to Catholicism and pretty much eradicated much of the population in the region through the spread of disease and just open warfare. So it's important to understand that one of the last regions that needed to be colonized by the Spanish and the Portuguese were down in Brazil. Every place else was Spanish, which is why we have the heavy influence over the folks in Latin America, Central America, Mexico, various islands in the Caribbean speak various languages. The Cuba is Spanish, Puerto Rico is Spanish, but then you have some other English and French, and we can talk about that later in terms of understanding the complexity of the history of the Caribbean. But the thing to remember is what the illustration is showing. The Portuguese and the Spanish dominated the Western Hemisphere for 100 years before the Spanish even got their first boats out and made it over across the Atlantic Ocean. And during that time, the Spanish had a tremendous impact on the native people here in North Carolina and throughout the entire hemisphere. Pardo explores the western parts of North Carolina, building fortifications, engaging in trade, and spreading disease, which ravages and devastates many native populations in the western part of the state and throughout the state of North Carolina. So in and around and along the river basin, both the Cape Fear River Basin and the PD River Basin, pretty much west of that basin, the Spanish are impacting and influencing native people all over South Carolina and North Carolina, particularly in the western part of the state. People have this assumption, like I said, again, the fact that you don't know something doesn't mean it's not so. You just don't know. Documents are very clear. Spanish extensively explored, mapped southeastern United States. They knew who all the native people were. They knew their languages. They knew their capital cities. They knew all of the people in the region. They traded with the people, traded guns, axes, knives with them. They were very familiar with native peoples and native cultures in the Western Hemisphere. And they also, not just in the Southeast, in Florida, in Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, but also in North Carolina, the Spanish attempted to colonize and build missions and Christianize the Tuscarora Indians, the Powhatan Indians, the Indians of Virginia and North Carolina, but they failed. And one of the reasons why they failed is because the Indians of North Carolina, the Tuscaroras, were a democracy. And those Indians that were in confederation with them were a part of their democracy. And they were treated as equals. And so you could not sow division between the Haudenosaunee, between the Tuscaroras and their kinsmen to the north, the Iroquois Confederacy, because of the military alliances and the kinship alliances that they held with one another, although they did try. And because they tried, and because of the, interactions that they had with the native people, they too then spread disease again throughout Virginia and throughout North Carolina, and it has a devastating effect on the native populations in the state. Why am I saying this and touching on this? Because if you want to understand native interactions with the English when they come almost 100 years later, you have to understand the damage that was already done by the Spanish prior to them arriving. And even then, when they arrive and they interact with the native people that are here, the Tuscaroras are still clearly a dominant group of Indians and one of the most powerful nations of Indians in the history of North America. And they have to deal with them. And it takes them 100 years. It takes them until 1711 to defeat them in war, to be able to expand into and settle in North Carolina. I bet to warn you about the illustrations that are coming up, but it's important to understand that the impact that the Spanish have on North Carolina natives, particularly the Tuscaroras and other Indian groups in Virginia and in North Carolina, is pretty profound. So I'll prepare you that some of the images that are coming up are pretty graphic. These images were actually drawn by Bartholomew, who was a Catholic priest who accompanied the Spanish conquistadors on their campaigns throughout North Carolina, Virginia, and the rest of Western Hemisphere when they were conquering and defeating native people. They are attacking, and they attack native villages in an effort to forcibly convert the native people to Catholicism and to have them submit to Spanish rule. Next slide. So they used their weapons of war, they used their war dogs to track and basically attack Native people. They attempt to intimidate Native people by executing their chiefs and clan mothers and seizing goods from their villages. So a campaign of terror against Native people, particularly in North Carolina and Virginia, in an effort to establish missions and establish a foothold and control in North Carolina and the Virginia area. I'm going to pause on this image for a moment. So I was a fellow for the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, and I was doing research. They have the largest Native American collection pretty much in the US, outstanding collection, particularly for old Native groups that date back to early contact. In the collection, there was a story. They have recorded interviews with Tuscaroras, a set of interviews from 1918 and a set of interviews from the 1930s. The ones in 1930 were tape recorded using the early reel-to-reel tapes, and the others were transcribed. And in that, there was a story about the handless maiden. And I hadn't seen these illustrations by Bartholomew, so I assumed that when he talked about the handless maiden, that was some kind of metaphor. It was just, something to scare the kids and, to just kind of make a point. But this beautiful young Indian woman who had no hands. And then when I got to Bartholomew's material, I realized that the Spanish actually did chop the hands and the feet off of Native Americans to intimidate them and to force them into obedience under Spanish rule. Okay. So it's important to understand that the Spaniards had a profound, Europeans, Spanish, had a profound impact on Native people in North Carolina, particularly the Native Americans in North Carolina. They failed. The Indians of Virginia and North Carolina fell into alliance. They burned the mission, they killed the priests, and they destroyed the fortifications in the western part of the state, and it redefined the political boundaries and military alliances throughout the state of North Carolina. Spanish would never get a foothold in North Carolina or Virginia. The English would come and attempt to get a foothold in 1584, and even they would fail because the memory is long and the natives don't forget. And they don't forget what the Spanish had done to them. It's passed down orally from generation to generation, and they are prepared when the English come and they meet the English with the same resistance and the same skepticism, particularly the Tuscaroras, that they met the Spanish with. So we're going to hit 2 more slides and I'll stop and I'll let people ask questions. So that first slide is to introduce again what is happening in North Carolina. I was talking earlier about the fact that I'm working on 2 more books. And that book is one is about Indian Woods, which is the Tuscarora Reservation in Bertie County, North Carolina. And the other will be on the Tuscaroras of North Carolina and their history. And I argue in my book that they were one of the first triracial Indian nations, triracial peoples in North America. And we know that the Spanish, for example, early on began the mixing of peoples from the Western Hemisphere and from Africa and Europe, because they brought Africans over with them when they came, right? And so there's this trade back and forth. You also know that there was a Native American slave trade, and the Spanish started it. And they took tens of thousands of Native American women in particular back to Spain and back to Europe, where they sold them off as sex slaves. And then they came into the Americas and they exploited the Americas and used Native Americans to work on, plantations, sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, work in the mines, coffee plantations throughout the Western Hemisphere. Okay. So they begin the process of bringing Africans and other Europeans and Native people together and mixing them throughout the Caribbean, throughout Central America and South America. It's thoroughly mixing people. But then in North Carolina, we have our own history of mixing. And I'm going to be brief about that and we'll stop. And we'll talk about that again, very briefly, then I'll stop. So after the Spanish, when we come to North Carolina and we talk about the merging of Native, African, and European peoples, one of the things that we're going to see in North Carolina, and the Spanish started, is a creolization of people. My ancestors are Tuscarora, African, and European. As I mentioned at the start when I was talking, my ancestors lived from here hundreds of years from Indian Woods, hundreds of years. Yeah, I know where the Indian burial grounds are, slave cemeteries are, and of course, all of our family cemeteries that have been there since the end of the Civil War. So we have an ancient history in Eastern North Carolina, and it's a blended history. I have cousins that are fairer than I, cousins who look white, cousins got blue eyes, green eyes, gray eyes, or we call them hazel eyes. I mean, all different shades of color, all different mixtures. And that comes from this creolization that happens in Eastern North Carolina and happens in Bertie County as early as 1584. And so that's just one of those unforgotten histories of North Carolina, is the fact that we have a great many people who have a mixed heritage. This last slide, and then I'm gonna stop and let people ask questions. One more, past this one. And so when we talk about the early English in North America, and we talk about the English coming to America, exploring America, because this is, of course, one of John White's early drawings in 1584. The record that was established on Native people in North Carolina is the best anywhere in the New World, anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, even better than England. When we think of New England, we think of Brown, we think of Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Dartmouth. We think of, highly intellectual, people in the New England area in the Northeast. But the only place that has the comprehensive understanding of Native culture and Native people and documenting in terms of mapping, because you can clearly see this as Eastern North Carolina, right? You all are pretty good geographers. You can see that these are the Outer Banks. Just got it turned sideways. These are the Outer Banks. This is the Albemarle Sound. This is the Chuan River, the Roanoke River, Roanoke Island. You all can clearly see that, right? Did an outstanding job in 1584 of drawing the landscape of Eastern North Carolina, mapping all the major Indian villages that they came into contact with and all the major Indian groups. My people, Indian Woods, is right here. It's an area called Moratuck, right on the Roanoke River. We still live there. People still there. Continuously documented, recognized community of Tuscarora people from first contact in 1584 to the present. And you'll find maps from the 1580s, from the 1590s, from the 1600s, from the 1620s, 1640s, 1700s, start of the Tuscarora War, all the way up, documenting the community and the Native people that are there. And then after the Tuscarora War in 1717, there in that same region, they established the reservation called Indian Woods, which is a Tuscarora reservation and one of the first reservations ever established in the United States of America. So I'll stop there. I think I've given you all plenty to think about. Hopefully I've illustrated it well in a straightforward way. And if you have any questions, you can ask me questions and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. You should be using indigenous. Like I said, I'm old. I don't know how young I look, but I'm an old person. I'm very old. And when I started doing the work, yeah, the term was Indian, and again became Native American, and today it's indigenous or First Peoples. So I know the terms. It's just kind of like for African American history. It would be used to be Negro, colored, Black, now African American. And so in doing the histories, you try to do it in context, right? So if you're using documents and the documents are referring to Native people as Indians, even though we know that's not their correct term, then you may use the term to, from those documents because you're quoting those documents, right? But yes, the terms that Native people, and then most Native people want to be called by their nation. So they have a nation. So whether that's Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, Mattaponi, Pamunkey, Machapunga, they all have nations, they have a name. It's like being French or English or Irish or German, or Welsh. I mean, they have a identity, a national identity, and they prefer to be called by their nation. But yes, the more modern terms are indigenous people is what we would use, when we talk about Native Americans or First Peoples, because they were first on the land. So, yeah, right. So the short answer to that question is simply this. What really supported Native peoples in North America, in North Carolina, until the Tuscarora War, the Outer Banks. Early on, turn to the next slide to see if I show it. Nah, okay, go back. Early on, when the English first came to Roanoke Island and came to North Carolina, there were only like 2 or 3 ways to get in through the Outer Banks, right? And the sands were constantly shifting and they were shallow, and countless ships have run aground and sunk. And so the Outer Banks were like a natural barrier. One of the other things, that are barrier mountains, right? The only 1 or 2 ways to get into the mountains, right? We talked about the Roanoke River Valley. When the Tuscaroras retreated after the Tuscarora War, they retreated into Virginia, and then they retreated into the Roanoke River Valley. And there's only like 1 or 2 ways to get in. You got to come in on the Roanoke River into the valley, and they'll annihilate you, coming in that way. So the Outer Banks basically protected them from heavy ships coming in with heavy cannon and folks coming in like they did in Jamestown, where just large numbers of people could come in, pretty readily and openly, and they were able to get their settlement set up and then get it protected and then kind of advance out from there. And that's what they were attempting to do at Roanoke Island. They were setting up, Roanoke Island was going to be like their advancement point, right? You get the fort set up at there, stage all your troops there, and then from there you go into the interior and you attack the Indians. But the Tuscaroras say they came out to the island and they destroyed the fortification. They're the ones that destroyed the lost colony, and they were not allowing the English to get a foothold in their region. Broader point of that question is change is change, right? And we're in the midst of it right now, right? So Native people were truly in the Stone Age. Their weapons were made with bone, they were made with stone, they had war clubs, they had tomahawks, they had bows and arrow. Their warriors were as fierce and as brave as anybody's warriors, and their ability to fight was as good as anybody. But they were not a match for guns and for artillery. So natives wanted guns, and they wanted gunpowder and lead, and they wanted those weapons, knives and axes. They didn't have knives and they didn't have axes, right? They had stone cutting tools. They didn't have knives and axes. So they wanted to trade with Europeans to get those technologies, to get those weapons, right? The same way people are trading today to get certain things that they want. And pots, pans, because they made clay pots, which broke. You see what I'm saying? They wanted those goods from the Europeans. So they would have eventually traded with, whomever they could trade with to get the trade goods, because that's why the Powhatans allowed the English to settle amongst them, was because they had the opportunity to trade and get guns, knives, axes, and these commodities that were manufactured in England that they couldn't otherwise have. And there were divisions within the communities about this, right? We don't really need to be dealing with these people, but it's really difficult. If I take an example might be the washing machine, right? You can wash your clothes by hand. You know anybody that washes their clothes by hand today? You know anybody who would want to wash their clothes by hand today? So you're doing the stuff that you were doing. They would dig out canoes. They would cut down the whole tree, dig the inside of the tree out, burn it out, put it, light fires in it to burn it out to make a canoe. That's how they made their canoes. Versus now having axes to chop the tree down and to chop it out, or you see what I'm saying? The technology was just such that they needed and wanted access to the technology. But what the Europeans do, understand, they do two things. One, they give them the guns, but they don't give them technology to make guns. And they give them, and you got to go trade with them to get the gunpowder and to get the lead. Otherwise, the gun is worthless. You just got a long pipe with the hole in it. So you got to get the gunpowder and you got to get the lead to use the gun. And that means you got to go back and trade with the Europeans again for those commodities, because they're not going to teach you how to make gunpowder and they're not going to teach you how to make lead. You see what I'm saying? So it was an imbalance, a trade imbalance that was going to be there, you know. And yes, eventually over time, the Spanish were going to, you know, someone was going to eventually move into the area. But it is also important to understand that even with that expansion by the Spanish in the rest of the hemisphere, that would not have been possible without alliances with other Indians. How they did that was that the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas, who were the most powerful peoples and had the greatest empires, they did exploit other Indian groups. They did exploit those groups, and those groups hated them. They despised them. They hated them. So when the Spanish came and they wanted the gold from those empires, right? They wanted the gold. Those groups were ready to align themselves with them because they wanted to destroy the Aztecs too and destroy the Incas and the Mayans too. What they didn't anticipate is that once they were destroyed, that the Spanish were going to turn on them and enslave them and completely decimate them the way that the Spanish did. That's what they didn't anticipate. So I hope I answered the question. Yes. I did not directly. I did not directly. So back up, maybe go forward. I'm trying to think. They'll go forward since we've seen the past. Go forward. You can go forward again. A lot of good stuff here. I'm leaving these records with you all so you all can look at these great stuff. All this stuff is out of the archives. One more. We'll stop here, and I'll yeah, stop. Well, go ahead and go one more. Keep going. I'll tell you when to stop because it's a good slide in here that I want to show that will help. Okay, back up one more. Okay, so we'll start with this one. So to your question about Lumbees, I'm pausing because this is history. This is being historical. And I told the group here before, the nation of Indians that were in North Carolina, the most dominant group of Indians in North Carolina at the time of contact with the Tuscaroras. There were smaller groups of Indians in the coastal plains. Advance a couple of more slides, we may find a better one. So this is a whole nother discussion about the Africans that were brought to Roanoke Island. Y'all, you know, we wouldn't get into all that. That's a whole nother discussion. One more. I'll tell you when to stop because there's a really good map. Keep going. That will help me explain to her her question. Keep going. One more. That's the one. So, as I showed and talked to them, the Spanish and the English knew all the Indians that were in, you know, the southern part of the United States, from North Carolina down to Florida, Texas, and on back to the West, California. They were well documented. Their capital towns, you know, their chiefs, well documented by the Spanish and also by the English. So this is a conversion of the map we were just looking at that was drawn in 1584 by the English, right? So we know all the nations of Indians that were in eastern North Carolina. You know, the Bear River or Bay River Indians, the Machapungas, the Mattamuskeet, the Choanoaks, the Yippon, the Hatteras Core, the Neuse Martuck, Pamlico, Nottaways, and Meharins up in Virginia. We knew all the Indians. And all of these coastal Indians that's up here listed at the time of the Tuscarora War in 1711, they were all in confederation with the Tuscaroras. So when the Tuscaroras went to war in 1711, all of these Indians were their allies. And all of these Indians were intermixed. When I say intermixed, you have to understand with Native people, you can't trade with them unless you're kin. And you can't be kin to them unless you take one of their women and marry one of their women. So all of these Indians were related to and connected to the Tuscaroras because of their relationships, their kinship structure through marriages and through trade. So the Lumbees, the name Lumbee was given to the Lumbee in the 20th century to identify them as Native people. But historic nation of Indians, there's never been a historic nation of Indians called Lumbee. What the Lumbees would be is a mixture of the Indians that were here, which would be Tuscaroras. In fact, many Lumbees are Tuscaroras. In fact, as I've said to you before, my people come from the Roanoke River, from Berkeley County, from Indian Woods, right here. They're Tuscaroras. It's Tuscarora Reservation. Well, I know the Locklears, the Lowrys, the Oxidines, the Berries, they all come from Indian Woods. They moved to Robeson County from Indian Woods. I mean, my great-great-grandmother's a Berry. You know, Henry Berry Lowry, if y'all know anything about Lumbee history or history of Robeson County, everybody knows Henry Berry Lowry. Henry Berry Lowry was the great Robin Hood of Robeson County, right? If you're native, you know who Henry Berry Lowry is. If you're not native and you don't know the history of North Carolina, you don't. But Henry Berry Lowry was a terror to whites in Robeson County. You know, he terrorized them. And be brief on that story because I'm long-winded on answering the questions. But during the Civil War, the Confederates killed Henry Berry Lowry's father and his brother. And as is the way with Native people, they believe in blood feuds. Blood feud lasts for 100 years. They believe in the blood feud. So when they killed his father and brother, made them dig their own graves, shot them dead, he hunted down and killed the members of the Confederate Home Guard that participated in his father's death and brother's death. State of North Carolina put a bounty on his head as high as $20,000, which is a lot of money in 1800s, to hunt him down. He killed every bounty hunter that came after him. So finally, they amassed a regiment. They amassed a group and put it under command of a Confederate general, officer, not general, but officer, to hunt this man down. They sent him to Robeson County to hunt him down. And he proceeded to get his wife, his sisters, and his mother, and took him to the jail and said, if you don't turn yourself in, we're going to kill your family. So you know what he did. Right? He said, kill him. And I'll go to each one of your homes in the dead of night, and I'll kill every one of your mothers, every one of your sisters, and every one of your daughters. And they let them go. And they never caught Henry Berry Lowry. He is a legend in Robeson County among the Lumbee Indians. He was a Tuscarora. Well documented. He's Tuscarora. His group, they were Tuscaroras. My point is that the Lumbees are clearly Native people, and they are clearly a mix of Native peoples, but they are, many of them, Tuscaroras. And the historical record bears it out. Because I have gathered maps from, like I said, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, you know, and they show all advanced 2 or 3 more slides to see if I have it in this one. One more. Keep going, I'll tell you when to stop. Because there's a historic map in here, and I want to show that historic map. That's the one, stop right there. So this map was done at the start of the Tuscarora War, to your point about Lumbees. And you can see again my community, Indian Woods, right here in Bertie County, all the Tuscarora villages that are there. You see along the Tar River, the Tuscarora villages. You see along the Neuse River, the Tuscarora villages. This is eastern North Carolina, and the Lumbees are down here in southeast North Carolina, Robeson County, but I already told the group that was here at the start, pretty much from Wilmington, the Cape Fear River, everything from the Cape Fear River north was Tuscarora territory. Well documented. Ain't no question about that. There's no question, no discussion. Tuscaroras controlled everything from the coastal plains. I told you all the coastal Indians were in confederation with them. They controlled everything from the Outer Banks all the way up to the sources of the Roanoke River and the sources of the Tar, Neuse, and Cape Fear rivers, which takes them up into Greensboro and into Winston-Salem and Raleigh. All of that coming on down was their territory. So we know that the name Lumbee was given to these Native people in the early 20th century. So they are clearly Native people. Everybody understands they're Native people, but it's just, unfortunately, historically, there was never a nation of Indians called Lumbee. So they are remnants of perhaps Petee Indians, Chiricahua Indians, you know, Catawba Indians, Tuscarora Indians. And we know a great many of them are Tuscarora because there are at least 5 sections. I do a lot of work in Robeson County because this is my region. This is what I do my research on, Eastern North Carolina, and on Native and Black people. And so I know the ones at Prospect and at Saddle Creek. I mean, I know all the different Tuscaroras. And Maxton, Chief Locklear at Maxton, and his people came from Indian Woods. So I know most of the groups, you know. And some of them have always said they're Tuscarora, because they say if we're not Tuscarora, then what are we? When they changed the name to Lumbee, a lot of folks left and moved to Kentucky and moved down to Georgia and moved over to Tennessee, because they're like, we're not, you know, you're either English or you're not. You're either Welsh or you're not. You're either Irish or you're not. You're either German or you're not, right? You know, we're Tuscaroras. And you take my name away, then what am I? I'm nothing. You know, I have no identity. I'm not a nobody. So they left. They just said, well, no, we're not going to be Lumbee because we're not Lumbee. You know, we're this. And there are groups that stayed there that were radical about their belief. Tuscarora is known as being radical. You know, they were radical about, you know, staying Tuscarora. We're Tuscaroras. You know, we're not going to be anything else. So long answer again to a short question.
Lumbee.
Mhm.
So you were, north in North Carolina is like Tuscarora. What was south? What was in those other areas to the south of those?
Oh, so I have to go back to that other illustration, but yeah, so south, you're going to have basically, you're going to have your Yamasees, you're going to have your Santee, you definitely got PDs, you got Chirwa, you know, down in, you know, south of the border in North Carolina. But even down in that area, like Wolf Pit, I think it's called Wolf Pit. You know, Wolf Pit, those folks at Tuscarora, I know some people down at Chance and I know a bunch of folks there. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so on that borderline there, because just south of Robeson County, I mentioned a lot of the Lumbees are Tuscaroras, and they will tell you they're Tuscarora. You got situations in Robeson County where you have families where, of course, you know, the kids are Lumbee, because they have to sign up with the state as Lumbee to be recognized as Native and to get the benefits, right? But the grandparents say we're Tuscaroras. And then the more radical middle-aged young folks say, well, grandma said we Tuscaroras, we're Tuscaroras. But then the sister or brother might say, well, we're Lumbee. So it's just that complex in Robeson County that, you know, it's set up in such a way that the state provides support for them as Lumbees, not as Tuscaroras. And so, you know, a lot of people, you know, they sign up as Lumbee rather than Tuscarora. But to your point, if you're from there or know Wolf Pit and that area down there, I know the folks down there. I mean, a lot of them are related to the same people across the border. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in South Carolina is Tuscarora or anything like that, not at all, and that you can't be a mix. It's just like up here, you also got your Hallawaa and most people know in Hollister, you got Saponis in Hollister, and then up near the Saponis up there near Alamance in Alamance County off of 8540 going to Greensboro. So there are several communities. Then the Maharons are up in Hertford County. On this map, you even see the Maharon Reservation right there on the border between Berkeley County and Hertford County. So yeah, all of these folks, when they start doing the DNA 23andMe and stuff, all of them are related by blood. The Saponis, the Nottaways, you know, the Tuscaroras, even the Machapungas, you know, and the Bay River Indians, they're all end up being related by blood. So there's some, you know, variation of it because that's the trade route, right? 11 will run down out of Virginia, straight through Eastern North Carolina, and pretty much goes straight down to Robeson County. So does like 17, and so there's like I said, with 258, all these roads, 64, 70, they're going east-west, but north-south is 11, 17, and 13. And they all run and converge right down in the Robeson County area. And then 87, which we call the Iroquois East Gate, you can take 87, goes right on up into Virginia and on up into the mountains. The Mohawks and the Iroquois used to come down on 87 all the time to attack, you know, the Catawbas and the Cherokees and to take revenge against the North Carolinians for destroying the Tuscaroras in the Tuscarora War. Last thing, I guess I have to say this, so we talk about, because we didn't get to the Tuscarora War, but the Tuscarora War, a lot of natives were involved in the war. unfortunately. Cherokees, Creeks, Catawbas, Yamasees, they fought with the colonists against the Tuscaroras. In fact, more Indians than whites fought against the Tuscarora in that war. And what people don't understand is that once they were defeated, they were treated into Virginia and back up into the, to New York and then Canada. But the Five Nations, in retaliation for their defeat, sent hundreds of warriors south. And they always tell you that the period from the end of the war in 1713 until 1718 for whites in North Carolina was more destructive than the war itself. They burned houses, burned schools, burned courthouses. They just wreaked havoc in eastern North Carolina and down south. And then they turned their attention to the southeastern Indians who helped the whites destroy the Tuscaroras, and they completely annihilated the Yamasees, fought a war of extermination against the Cherokees and the Catawbas and the Creeks. All of them had to surrender, and all of them had to go to Onondaga, New York, and sue for peace and dance with their feathers down around the council fire for the Onondagas. In fact, if you take 85 to South Carolina or down to Georgia to Atlanta, have you ever seen Seneca, South Carolina, down near Clemson? On the way down, you pass a town called Seneca. It's called Seneca because the Seneca Indians they sent regents down from New York State. They sent a chief there to serve as the governor of that region because they had defeated the Catawbas and the Cherokees and all the southeastern Indians after the Tuscarora War. And they had to pay tribute to the Iroquois Confederacy. It's just a whole nother history. I mean, that war set off a continental war between Indians, and it was just a whole nother history that's never written about or talked about in North Carolina history or generally in U.S. history because nobody really cared what was happening with the Indians out in that region. They only cared about the governors and the colonial leaders and the fact that they had won control of North Carolina. And so now opened up to tobacco production and they began to expand tobacco. And we know, North Carolina became rich from tobacco, most of our wealthiest families were tobacco families, and that money came from the coastal plains of eastern North Carolina, which is some of the richest farmland in North Carolina, even today. Billion-dollar industry, multi-billion-dollar industry is agriculture in North Carolina today. And most of that agriculture is in eastern North Carolina. So, you've been a great group. Yeah.
We want to know what materials you suggest that she and Dan go buy info.
Oh, I can, tell them if they will email me. The email address is small W number 5, okay, at nccu.edu. And I will share, I designed a course on Tuscarora history when I was at North Carolina A&T. It's still the only course on Tuscarora history in the state of North Carolina, in the country. Only one there was a Cherokee history course, I think, at Chapel Hill, but no one's ever done a course on Tuscaroras. So I can provide all kinds of documents, all kinds of primary and secondary sources. Yeah. So if you email me, I'll overload them with material. So, and of course, they can have access to the PowerPoint if you can share that freely with anybody. We didn't get to, 1/4 of it. There are lots of really great maps and content that will be beneficial and useful to anyone who's interested. You're welcome. No, thank you all.
Everybody for coming. Michelle, did you have any announcements as HR? Are you good to go? All right, cool. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Oh, thank you.
I work in the corporate office and Jalen is,
Charge it for the person.
no, but this is gonna break, thank you. And so it's nice when we get to do that. It's your lane, when we get to help us and just understand that we're so diverse in history as a country. And the reason I asked about Zambia is because I'm from Eastern North Carolina and my husband's from it's understanding originating. Okay.
Yeah, because I'm east of you in Bertie County, so, and to your point, with this map being up, so Nash County is gonna be basically right there in the heart
Yes,
of the Tuscaloosa.
yes, yes, yes. So I'm